Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa amma ba'd. قال الله تبارك وتعالى وأنفقوا في سبيل الله ولا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة وأحسنوا إن الله يحب المحسنين. وقال الله تبارك وتعالى وأقيموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة. وقال الله عز وجل إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل فريضة من الله والله عليم حكيم. صدق الله العظيم. Respected brothers, sisters, dear elders, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the human being for His worship and has put the human being in a series of tests through which Allah Azza wa Jal examines him to test his loyalty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and gives him a chance to prove his dutifulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The worship that the human being does it begins with his body, but it is not limited to, it does not end with his body. Our ubudiyyah, our servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses every area of our life. We worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through certain acts, devotional acts, but we also worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the way we earn and through the way we spend. And amongst those worships, those acts of worship that involve our wealth is obviously zakat, which is one of the pillars of Islam. It is one of the things that a person is required to do as an ongoing obligation throughout life. Now, this is an example of a financial worship. Zakat is an ibadah, it's an act of worship. It doesn't involve the body, it involves a person's wealth. Hajj, on the other side, is a worship that involves a person's body and their wealth. Salat is an act of worship that involves just the body. Siyam is a worship that involves just the body, and zakat involves just the wealth. Now, because it is an act of worship, so just like in salat, we look at the prerequisites of salat. Are the prerequisites being fulfilled or not? Because we know if certain conditions are not fulfilled, the salat is not valid. A person goes into salat without wudu, without tahara, they know that their salat is not valid. Somebody starts their salat okay, but does something during salat which nullifies it, we know that the salat is not valid. Similarly, zakat has a very clear structure of instructions around it. And normally the fiqh of zakat would be taught over many sessions, and it would be taught over weeks or possibly months, because it is a very engaging subject. There are a lot of intricacies, a lot of fine points, and a lot of necessary things to understand even before we understand the key points. There are a lot of underlying rules. There are a lot of concepts that the Quran is mentioning, the Hadith is mentioning, the fatwa of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum are clarifying for us. And the ideal way to learn the fiqh of zakat is in a great deal of detail and understand what Quran says, what Hadith says, and from a very detailed perspective. However, given the fact that Ramadan is upon us, and this is a time when many Muslims around the world are discharging their zakat, it was felt appropriate that if we can have even one session, even if it's brief, we can cover the major aspects that every Muslim absolutely should know. So, without going into too much detail about the significance of zakat, I'll just mention a couple of things. Zakat is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has obligated on every Muslim. Zakat was obligatory on previous ummahs as well. Just like Salat was and Siyam was, these duties were obligatory on previous ummahs as well. On this ummah, when did it become fard? Most fuqaha and muhaddithin are of agreement that zakat actually became fard in essence, in concept, while Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was in Makkah. And the details of zakat, the nisab, when does it become due, and from how much wealth is it due, from what kinds of wealth, what percentage is due, all of those details were given in Medina. Now, the Quran hundreds of times repeats the message of Aqimus Salah wa Atuz Zakah. Zakat is not a tax. Zakat is a charity. It is an obligatory charity. And this charity is structured in such a way from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if it is fulfilled properly, then poverty is eradicated from the world. And people get to stand on their own feet. And this actually happened when the Muslims were implementing the system of zakat. A time came when they would have a great deal of difficulty in finding someone who was eligible for zakat. So they would take their zakat money and go from place to place, literally from neighborhood to neighborhood, looking, is there someone here who is an eligible recipient of zakat? And they would not be able to find it. And examples like this are found in the history of Islam, especially in the era of Umar bin Abdul Aziz rahimahullah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had, because they had learned how to manage their assets and their wealth, so the wealth had circulated through all sectors of society. The wealth was circulating. It was not being pooled to one end of society, where a small percentage of society has all the wealth, and then the overwhelming portion of society has a very small proportion that's divided amongst all of them. Some of the most developed countries today, if you look at the statistics of wealth, you'll find that 7% or less than 7% of the population of that country have over 90% of the wealth in that country. I'm talking about, without taking any names, the most developed and advanced countries today. 7%, and in some cases less than 7% of people own 90% of the wealth that exists in that entire country. So talk about disparity. So what's happening to the other 93%? What are they going through? They're going through what we see. They're going through these same crises that the entire world seems to be based on. The crisis of taking interest-based loans. The crisis of getting a house but not being able to pay it for the next 30 years, not being able to own it for the next 30 years. In some countries, they were issuing mortgages for 50 years, 50-year mortgages. So most of the people who sign that mortgage, either they'll be too old by the time they're finished, or they would, instead of leaving assets behind to their heirs, they would be leaving these debts behind to their heirs. So zakat is an obligation. It is a system through which wealth is circulated through society. It is a system through which poverty is absolutely eradicated. And it is for those who give it a purification of all of their wealth. And there is a great deal of text from Quran and from Hadith that goes into this, that really explains this. But a lot of this is known to Muslims. And the Prophet ﷺ has told us, and Allah Azza wa Jal first has told us in the Quran, that whatever you give for zakat, specifically zakat, وَمَا آتِيتُم مِّن زَكَاةٍ تُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَ اللَّهِ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُضْعِفُونَ. That zakat that you give for the pleasure of Allah, the people that are doing that, they are going to increase their wealth. They're going to increase their wealth. وَمَا آتِيتُم مِّن رِّبًا لِيَرْبُوَ فِي أَمْوَالِ النَّاسِ فَلَا يَرْبُو عِندَ اللَّهِ. And whatever you're giving, you're paying as interest on your loans, that wealth it might seem like you're increasing the wealth of the person you're giving it to, but in fact their wealth is not increasing. Allah is finding other reasons to decrease and diminish their wealth. And through zakat, whatever omissions and commissions, minor ones, were made in the process of earning, ghafla, being unmindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being unmindful of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all of these minor sins are expiated through the payment of zakat. When zakat is given, and zakat literally means to purify, it means a purification, then all of the wealth becomes pure. Becoming pure means it becomes solely beneficial, purely beneficial. And when zakat is not paid, then this impurity remains in the wealth. What does that mean? That all of the wealth cumulatively becomes problematic. Problems arise through this wealth, problems occur to this wealth. So zakat is a way of getting rid of those problems. And zakat is also a way of securing our wealth. And is also a way of protecting our wealth. So, we should read the books of fadail that talk about the fadail of zakat and the fadail of sadaqat. The one that comes to mind most frequently is Fadail Sadaqat by the Shaykh Maulana Muhammad Zakaria Sahib Rahimahullah. This is an unparalleled book in this regards. And every Muslim should have this in their house, and every Muslim should read this. Our sisters should also make a point of reading this book. It's filled with Quranic verses and ahadith and stories pertaining to spending. It's all about spending. And it talks about the human nature which wants to withhold. وَأُحْضِرَتِ الْأَنفُسُ الشُّحْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put this tendency inside the human being that he wants to withhold. He wants to keep. But then he also says, فَمَنْ يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمْ مُفْلِحُونَ. A person who is saved from his own tendency to withhold. A person who is saved from that tendency to withhold, to not spend, those people are the successful ones. So without further discussion on the significance and the virtues of zakat, we'll talk a little bit about the technical aspects of zakat. And the first thing to determine is, who is zakat fard on? So zakat is fard upon a Muslim who is sane and who possesses wealth up to a certain extent. Now in the hadith of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the extent of zakat, or the nisab as we say, the nisab of zakat, that amount that if a person has it and it stays with them for a year, that amount has been mentioned in hadith through dinars and dirhams. So for example, the hadith of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam talks about for every 20 dinars, half of a dinar. And for every 40 dirhams, 1 dirham. And for every 200 dirhams, which is 5 uqiyah, then 5 dirhams are given from every 200. In other words, 1/40th of the wealth is to be given. Now, but the condition is a person has to have 200 dirhams or 20 dinars. So how does that translate into our day and age? It's translated into gold and silver. Dinars were gold currency, and the dirhams were gold currency. At that time, the rate of exchange was 1 to 10 on the average. The average rate of exchange, yani 1 dinar consisted of 10 dirhams. So the modern equivalent of that in grams is 85 or 86 to be more precautious, 86 grams of gold. And if you want to err on the side of precaution, actually you can say 85 grams of gold if somebody has it. And I'll talk a little bit about cash in just a minute. Or 595 grams of silver. If a person has this amount of gold or silver, or both, and the amount of silver, the nisab of silver, is going to be less than the nisab of gold. But we go by the nisab of silver. So I don't know what the current rate of exchange is here in Australia, but whatever it is, it's very easy to calculate. The nisab of silver will be less and the nisab of gold will be more. Most of the fuqaha agree that the nisab of silver should be followed. In other words, if you have that much amount, zakat is due upon you. Why? Because it is more precautionary, it is more beneficial for poor people. However, one of the things that are under discussion today is that the cost of living has gone up. And a person who possesses the nisab of silver is not considered wealthy by any standard. In fact, you could have that amount and still not be able to pay your bills for that month. So one thing that is under discussion is that in countries where the cost of living is high, the nisab of gold should be followed. There is room for it. There is room for it. And if somebody takes the nisab of gold and works with it, especially for example someone who is poor in hand to mouth, and if they start giving zakat, their own expenses are not being met, and they're not having anything saved over, they're not having anything left over. So if they were to use the nisab of gold, it would not be sinful, it would be permissible. But in general circumstances, we should try to work with the nisab of silver. Now, this money needs to stay with a person for a period of 1 year. What that means is that from the first time a person came into possession of that much money, that is the date from which they became a wealthy person. A person of wealth, a person who is eligible to give zakat. Now, they don't have to pay zakat just yet. 1 year, one qamari, one lunar year is going to pass. And so zakat is calculated by the lunar months, not by the solar months. 1 lunar year passes from that time. Now we're going to see, do they still have that amount of money or not? If they still have that amount, or more, or a little less, but it's still above the nisab, then zakat is fard on this person. If by the time that year rolls around, they don't have that much money, zakat is not fard on them. If during the year the wealth increased, decreased, they earned, they spent, they earned, they spent, they gained, they lost, it doesn't matter. Whatever happens in between the timeline is negligible. And it's at the end, what happens at the end, that is taken into consideration. So for example, a person they got their first paycheck in their life, it was $1,000. Now this person zakat is due on this person. But they don't have to pay it right away. We're going to see 1 year from now, where are they at? If they have that amount or more, zakat is going to be due on them. Otherwise, zakat is not going to be due. The other discussion that takes place is, how old does a person have to be to pay zakat? Regarding this, there is a difference of opinion. And in many of the things that I am saying, there are subtle differences amongst the jurists, amongst the fuqaha. I am taking the more widely accepted opinions, or I will take the precautionary opinion in some cases, as you will see. Is zakat due on someone who has wealth, a child who has wealth but is not baligh? According to Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahumullah, the non-baligh child also has to give zakat. Their guardian or custodian, whoever is in charge of them and their wealth, needs to pay zakat from their money. According to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, a person who is not baligh, wealth, even if they have wealth, they do not have to give zakat. Each have their own dalil. The three imams, they use that hadith, the sahih hadith, where Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, while talking to those people that manage the wealth of orphans, he told them, you should invest it. Otherwise, the sadaqah, zakat is going to devour it all. So invest that money, keep it increasing. So they're saying that if it was not a question of zakat being paid, then there would not be a question of the wealth being diminished. So that means zakat was paid at that time. And the Ahnaf use that hadith where it says very clearly that there are certain categories of people, 3 categories of people that are marfu'ul qalam, they are not accountable for anything. So the insane person, for example, the insane person is not accountable for anything unless and until they gain sanity. Similarly, the child the child, as-sabiyyu hatta yablugh, until they reach the age of puberty, they are not accountable for anything. So if they're not accountable for anything, they're not accountable for salat. It's agreed upon that they're not accountable for their salat. Why should they be accountable for zakat? This is the argument on behalf of the Ahnaf. So those that are Hanafi can act according, can take this ruling and work with it. But if you were to give zakat from the wealth of that child, then Ahnaf say don't do it. To be very honest, they say don't do it because you don't have the right to. You don't have access to that child's wealth. It's the child's wealth. Don't spend from it. But if a parent were to give zakat on their own behalf for the sake of protecting the child's wealth, this is something commendable. Now, so that was the issue of that. Now what some people do is they will gift, mothers will buy gold and silver jewelry for their daughters while the daughters are still young. They're not baligh yet, but they're putting together some gold, some silver, some jewelry. Sometimes they will open up an account on the name of the child, and they're putting, some funds in that account, so that when the child grows up, they have something, they have some savings. So what is the ruling on this? So the ruling on this is that if an account has been opened on the name of the child, and the parents are not just using that as a vehicle for their own funds, it's actually for the child, it's money that's been put away, it's been given to the child, then following the Hanafi position, zakat is not due on it. The same thing applies to jewelry that's given to the child. That means that the parents say, yeah, I'm holding on to it for them, but I'm not going to touch it, I'm not going to use it ever for myself. So you've gifted it, you've made them the malik, and you've actually given them possession, but because they're small, you're looking after it for them. In those cases, there is no zakat. But if it's something that you're putting aside with the intention of giving it to them, so the parents buy the jewelry, yes, when our daughter gets older, when she gets married, we're going to give it to her, for example. This is still under the ownership of the parents, whichever parent has bought it, and they are liable to pay zakat on that. So we've clarified that. The same thing applies to accounts that are opened up in the names of children. If there's an actual account opened up on the name of the child, the parents are not touching that money, then until they're baligh, following the Hanafi position, there is no zakat due on it. Okay, and the same thing would apply to any other assets that are in the name of that child. Now what people should not do is use this as a loophole and start assigning things on their children's name and try to save themselves from zakat. For the next few years, they should not do this, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows our intentions, Allah knows what we are doing. The other thing is, what type of wealth is zakat due on? What kinds of assets? I mean, we own different kinds of things. So what is zakat due on? Let's say somebody is baligh, they're sane, they're Muslim, and they have wealth or property equaling this amount. Then how do you calculate it? Which assets are taken into consideration? So the first thing is, gold and silver are always taken into consideration. The second thing is, cash and liquid assets are always taken into consideration. So that means jewelry, or if you have gold bricks or biscuits that you've put aside, whether it's ready to be used, whether it's not ready to be used, whether it's in use or not, and that's the Hanafi position, even if it's in use, you have to pay zakat on any kind of gold, any kind of silver, any kind of cash, regardless of what currency it's in. These are the first category of things. Then there's another category of things. Investments. So investments could be in the form of, let's say somebody has bought shares in a company. Now those shares are an asset that could be liquidated, and it could be converted into money, into cash. So this is an investment that needs to be evaluated when they're calculating their zakat, when that zakat year is up. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. When their zakat year is up and they're calculating their their other assets, they need to evaluate the value of those assets at this time. So if we were to be, for example, somebody has shares in a company, then you would evaluate the current market value of those shares and give zakat on the current market value of those shares. There is a group of scholars that says, and there is absolutely, you're allowed to do this if you choose, but most people never get the clarity on the fine details, and that is that usually when you buy shares in a company, the shares are representative of two types of assets of the company. One is the solid assets of the company in terms of real estate, in terms of equipment, machinery, and all related things that are used to produce whatever it is that they're producing. Could be vehicles, these types of assets, and there is no zakat on those assets. The other type of assets that the company has is the money, the profits, the shares, all of those types of financial assets. So you only actually, if it's an actual share, if it's a true share, and I'm emphasizing this because a true share in a company is actually, it's a share in everything the company owns. It's a share in all of the assets and liabilities of that company, which includes their cars and their equipment and their whatever it is that they have. That's what an actual share would look like. But not all of those things are zakatable. It's only the liquid assets that the company has that are zakatable. If you can figure out how much of your share, what percentage of your share is consisting of the non-zakatable assets, and you can separate it from the zakatable assets of that company, you actually only have to pay zakat on the current market value of the zakatable aspects of that company. But like I said, many people never get that clarity. Some people, they might get statements that give that kind of clarity. That's something for you to figure out. The same thing applies to money that we have in retirement funds. Now there are two types of retirement funds. There are those that you contribute to yourself. You are making an annual contribution, or in some cases a quarterly or even a monthly contribution by yourself. Money is coming into your account, and then from you are passing it on, and it's being invested. The other way that it happens is very frequently through employers. That your employer makes the contribution on your behalf, and the money hasn't reached, it never really comes to you. Neither do you have access to it before retirement. This is another type of, in Canada we call them RRSPs, Registered Retirement Savings Plans, and you have other terms for those over here. But the concept is the same in all the countries. So regarding those contributions that your employer is making for you, and the money is neither reaching you, any going through you, nor do you have access to it, then many jurists are of the opinion that you also don't have to pay zakat on it, because technically it's not yours yet. It doesn't belong to you yet. It's been put aside for you, but it doesn't technically belong to you, nor is it in your possession, so you don't have to pay zakat on that. So that's something interesting to know. For businesses, if a person is in some kind of a sales business where they are selling something, then if they have an inventory of merchandise at the time their zakat year comes up and their zakat is due, if they have an inventory, and pay attention to this, it's only merchandise for sale. Something that they would actually get rid of. They would liquidate, they would sell it and make money off of it. If they have merchandise like that, for example, somebody has a garment store. So they have this inventory of garments that are sitting there. Of course, the stock is coming and going, but when the year is up, this person needs to take an inventory of the merchandise that they have right now and calculate what it is worth if they were to sell it. Yani, what is the sale value? Not the purchase price, not what you got it for. Because you're gonna be buying it, obviously, at a wholesale rate, but you're selling it at a retail rate, and the wealth is it's worth what you're selling, not worth what you're buying it for. So you will estimate any merchandise that is for sale, you will estimate it at its sales price and pay zakat on the current sales price of that merchandise. A business owner does not pay zakat on equipment. They do not pay zakat. So let's go back to that same store, that garment store. They'll have displays, for example. They'll have displays, they'll have racks, they'll have all kinds of little machinery and things to help set up, organize, tag, label. Zakat is not due on any of those things. Zakat is not due on packaging, for example, if you're not selling the packaging as an actual product. Somebody who is selling parts, for example, they have a business for parts, auto parts, let's say. Now they have a warehouse. In that warehouse, they have these lifts and cranes, and they have all of this equipment to manage the inventory and the merchandise. You don't pay zakat on those things. Similarly, somebody has a business where they're fixing things and they're also selling things. So let's say somebody has a cell phone, a mobile phone repair business. So they have some equipment that they use, but then there's also some phones and things that they sell. So whatever equipment it is that they're using, there's no zakat on that. Okay? The same thing applies to a property that you own and you are renting it out. You are renting it out. You don't have to pay zakat on the value of that property. So now we're talking about real estate. So you have, for example, somebody has a house, and the purpose of that house is to generate cash. They're going to rent it out. You do not have to evaluate the value of that real estate every year and pay zakat on the value of the property if you're renting it out. Yes, whatever income you're gaining from it, that's going to be a part of your income, and you're going to calculate that with the rest of your zakat money, with the rest of your money. Okay? The only time you pay zakat on real estate, on property, on land, is if you are buying it with the intention of selling it. In other words, you're buying it because this is either your business, you buy and sell property, or you see a chance to make some money and you're going to go in, and it's very clear, I am buying this so that I can sell it and make money. That's it. If you bought a property and you weren't sure what you're going to do with it, oh, there's a lot over there, it's for a reasonable price, I might develop it, I might build something on it, I might live there, I might sell it, you're unsure, you don't have to pay zakat on it. If there's a current house that you're living in and you decide to sell it, simply deciding to sell it does not mean that now you have to pay zakat on it. It's when you start the process of selling it. So keep this rule in mind for properties. If you bought it with the intention of selling it, then it is zakatable. But if you bought it for any other reason, personal use, leisure, it doesn't matter. Until you start the process, in our terminology, until you put it up for sale, it's not zakatable. Now, if you put it up for sale and your zakat year comes up, well, now that property is one of your zakatable assets. Now you do need to estimate the cost of it and give zakat on it. Otherwise you don't. Okay, I'm trying to be as specific as possible because we get a lot of these questions afterwards. What if somebody is in a partnership where one person is making the investment and the other person is doing all the work? So somebody takes an investment from someone and they're doing some trade, some business activity with it. So what happens in this case? What happens in this case is that the person who has made the capital investment is the one who has to pay zakat on that money, not the person who is doing the work. Even though the profits are going to be shared. Obviously the profits are going to be shared to the proportion that they have agreed on, but whoever is contributing the capital is the one that has to pay zakat. Okay? There will be some other, issues as well, but I'm trying to keep it as mainstream as possible so that it applies to the maximum number of people. There will always be specific scenarios, but you can bring those scenarios to us over the next few days, during Ramadan or any time before you pay your zakat. You can come up individually and we can talk about those scenarios. Let's talk a little bit about loans. One of the conditions for zakat is that if that asset or that cumulative amount of money that you have, it should not have debt over it. In other words, if there is a debt owing on the person, if the person must pay a debt, then the amount of that debt will be minused and subtracted. So let's say somebody has zakatable assets of $30,000, but they have a debt of $10,000. That $10,000 is going to be minused. It's going to be subtracted from that $30,000 of assets, and zakat will only be due on $20,000. But first understand what constitutes a debt. What can you call as a debt? So anything that is payable to a person or a body, including governments, this is considered a debt. So if you owe something to another person, to a group, to an organization, or even to a government, for example in the form of taxes, there are due taxes, the government is telling you, you need to pay this much by this much time, all of that is included as debt, all of that can be minused. Also, if a person has not paid the mahr that is due to their wife, this is also a debt this is a debt that is due upon a person, and they need to pay that. So it can also be subtracted from the assets. Okay? But something like Hajj, somebody has to go for Hajj. So they want to, this much money I put aside, that's for Hajj. It doesn't matter. That is a due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Currently, it's an asset. When you go for Hajj, that's between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But right now, that money it's a zakatable asset. Okay, so zakat needs to be paid from that. What about on the flip side? If I am owed money, so how does that work? So the way it works is that there are different levels of debts that a person can receive. One is a debt that a person is expecting to receive it. They are expecting to receive it. It might be later, it might be sometime, it might be a year later, a couple of years later, whatever was documented or agreed upon. But they are quite certain that they're going to get that debt. Any debt of that nature, it's considered an asset of yours and you need to pay zakat on that money. So the person giving the loan has to pay zakat on the money. Yes, you have this much relaxation that you can pay it after you get the money. You don't have to give it in the absence of the money, if you're not able to. If you do, it's good, it's better. But if you can't, you're not obliged to. You can pay it after you receive the money. But if there is a debt that there is little or no hope left, you have tried to claim it, you have made every effort possible to somehow get that money, but the person has either disappeared or they flat out refused and you're not having any success, then in that case, that is something that you don't have to pay zakat on anymore, because there's little or no hope that you're going to get it back. So it's not going to be considered one of your assets. Okay? At this juncture, a lot of people ask the question about mortgages. What about mortgages? Is this going to be considered as a debt against us because, it's a huge amount and so on and so forth? Regarding this, there are a number of opinions of the contemporary scholars, and the one that most are inclined to is that at most you can deduct what you owe that year from that year's zakat. Yani from one zakat year to the end of the year, whatever amount you are owing, that much you can deduct as a debt against you. You cannot deduct the whole mortgage, because then zakat is not going to apply to most people for most of their lives. Okay? So, and some jurists are a little bit stricter, and they're saying you can deduct what you have to pay that month, the month in which you're paying. So for example, if you're going to pay your zakat in May, then just the amount that you're going to be paying for your payment of May, that's what you can deduct, and the rest you have to pay for. You have to pay zakat on. Okay, so these are two opinions that, and both are acceptable. The second one is a little bit more strict, and the first one is a little bit more lenient, where you can deduct cumulatively the amount of money that you owe for that whole year. When calculating zakat, it's important that we try to be as specific as possible, and try to make sure that we're not leaving anything out. What happens sometimes is people are only taking one aspect of their assets, and they're giving a rough estimate of the zakat and they're paying it. This is not right. You should have an exact figure. You should have a precise figure. After that, if you give a little bit more, it's always a good idea to give a little bit more. But the calculation of, because this is our ibadah, so the calculation of zakat should be done as meticulously as possible. At this point, some people ask the question of zakat of the family. Who is supposed to pay the zakat of the family? So the first thing to understand is that there's no such thing as zakat of the family. Zakat is due upon individuals. It's like saying the hajj of the family, the salat of the family. No, it applies to individuals. It applies to each person if they are eligible, if it applies to them or not. If it applies to individuals. So one person in the family is not responsible for paying the zakat of everyone. Yes, they can voluntarily help facilitate, put the money together, send it off, so on and so forth, but it's not due upon anyone but the one who owns those assets. The same thing applies for husband and wife. So the zakat that is due upon the wife is due upon the wife. It is not the husband's responsibility to pay zakat on her behalf from his money. It's absolutely not. Just like it's not the wife's responsibility to pay zakat on behalf of the husband, irrespective of who is earning and who is not earning. But what happens in many cases is that the man is the primary breadwinner, so out of the goodness of their heart, they will pay on their behalf. So the question arises that, is the woman's zakat even discharged or not? So the answer to that is that if it is done with the consent of the woman, and I'm not sure if any woman would have an objection against that, but if it's done, as long as, that's just a technicality, as long as it's done with the consent of the woman, the zakat will be paid and it will be discharged. Okay? But having said that, it's not due upon the husband. And here's where it gets problematic for women. So, because we should understand their situation a little bit also. Women that are not earning often don't have a lot of cash assets. All they have is essentially what they're paying zakat on is their jewelry, their gold and silver. And they don't have the cash assets. So how are they supposed to get the cash to pay, on this jewelry? And they would not want to liquidate the jewelry, which if the husband didn't cooperate, that's essentially what they would have to do. Okay, so that's why it's okay if they work something out, and if the husband pays on her behalf, it's fine, it's acceptable. While we're on the topic of jewelry, keep in mind that zakat is due on gold and silver. It is not due upon gems. So pearls, diamonds, whatever precious stones there are, zakat is not due on those. So when you are getting your jewelry weighed, make sure you get just the gold and silver weighed separate from the stone, separate from the weight of the stone, because there's no zakat on that stone. And unless, the only time zakat is due on precious stones is if you have acquired them for the sake of selling them. Then it becomes like merchandise. The other question that's frequently asked is, what if the gold is not pure gold, or the silver is not pure silver? What if it's, for example, it's an object that has been gold plated and so on and so forth? So the ruling according to Ahnaf is that whichever metal is dominant in that article, that is what it will be considered. So if that article, let's say it's a piece of jewelry, it's mostly gold, it has some other alloy in it, it's not 24 carats, it's got something else mixed in it, it has some other, but it's mostly, predominantly gold, it's going to be considered gold. And if it's predominantly another alloy, another metal, then it's going to be considered the other metal, it's not going to be considered gold. Okay? So if something is simply gold plated, it doesn't really qualify as gold per se. Even though the precaution would be to estimate how much gold is in that gold plating and give zakat on it. This is the precaution. But many jurists would say that no, it's not, because it's a very small portion of that object, of that item, that article that is gold. So these are a few things pertaining to zakat of jewelry. Now, let's talk a little bit about who to pay zakat to, because this is the next big question and keep in mind that discharging the zakat right till it gets to the entitled, the eligible recipient, it's the responsibility of the muzakki, it's the responsibility of the person paying zakat. So ultimately, it's our worship, it's our responsibility, so we have to take the responsibility of making sure it reaches the right people. So who are the right people? The Quran gives 8 categories of people, and the most common and the most pertinent of them that relates to us are al-fuqara and al-masakin. So there is a difference of opinion as to which word implies what. Is fuqara the same as masakin and masakin the same as fuqara? Yes, in some usages of the language they are one and the same thing, but when they're used separately, then fuqara means something else, masakin means something else. According to Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahullah, a faqir is someone who doesn't have anything. A faqir is someone who doesn't have anything, and a miskin is someone who has, but it's not enough. And according to Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, it's the exact opposite. A faqir is someone who has, but it's not enough, and a miskin is somebody who doesn't even have the basics. Irrespective, both categories are mentioned in the Quran. Both are what we call masarif of zakat. Both are eligible recipients of zakat. So what does a poor person look like? What does it mean that this person is poor? So, you know, when we talked about who has to pay zakat, we talked about a few areas of wealth: gold, silver, cash, and merchandise. We talked about 4 types of wealth. If a person has these and they're equal to the nisab, then zakat is due. So keep these same 4 things in mind. So a poor person is going to be someone who doesn't have enough gold that reaches nisab, doesn't have enough silver that reaches nisab. They do not have enough cash that reaches nisab, and they do not have merchandise to sell that reaches nisab. Keep these 4 things in mind. And then there's one more thing to keep in mind. I'm keeping it very, very simple and practical, so hopefully it's easy to remember. The next thing to remember when it comes to recipients is they don't have unnecessary things that would equal the nisab of zakat. So somebody who has things of necessity, those things of necessity are not going to be counted against them. If they have things that are beyond their necessity, then we're going to say no. You're not eligible, you're not entitled for zakat. So let's go into this in a little bit more detail. Somebody has food in the fridge. They have some basic furniture, not very, very extravagant, but they have basic furniture in the house. They have the basic utensils of the house. But all of a sudden they've come down really, really short on money. Somebody lost their job, for example. Somebody became very, very sick, they can't earn for themselves anymore, and there's no one else in the family to earn. They have the basics, they have the things of necessity. They might even have a pantry filled with food that could take them through the next few weeks or the next even few months. They have that kind of the staples. But they don't have money to look after their day-to-day needs. Such a person, if they don't have that amount of gold or silver or cash or merchandise for sale, then they are eligible for zakat. So much so that if a person owns their own house, they own their house, and you'll find this in many poor countries. The person owns the house. They've been living there since, but they never really bought it. Maybe they inherited it. But they have their own house that they're living in. They're trying to make ends meet, but it's just not. So then what will we look at? We'll look at, do they have gold, silver, cash? No, they don't. Do they have, if they're running a business, do they have that much merchandise? No, if they don't, then we can give them zakat. They are eligible recipients of zakat. This is the clearest way to explain it to someone who is looking for recipients. Often what happens is, the questions that we get, especially at Ramadan time, we have relatives in such and such place, this is a situation, they have this but they don't have this, they have this but they don't have this. I'm giving you the kind of rule of thumb to help you navigate it by yourself. If you're still unsure, by all means come and ask. But these are the four major areas that we are looking at. Gold and silver, cash, merchandise, and then things beyond necessity. Now things beyond necessity, this is something that we'd have to look at based on the socio-economic dynamics of where they live. So in today's world, if somebody had like a basic computer in their house, this would not be considered something extra. It's a thing of necessity today. It's a thing of necessity. It's necessary for many, many things. But if a person's got this giant, massive plasma or LCD screen, TV, this big beautiful thing, it covers half of the house, well, yes, that is not something of necessity. That is absolutely something that's out of necessity. Okay? Somebody has some basic furniture, like I said, okay, fine, but someone's got this really lavishly designed house with all kinds of decorations and things. These are not things of necessity. They're definitely things that are way beyond necessity. Okay? Somebody has a cell phone. Today it's a thing of necessity. But if every single member of that house has got the latest model, then, there's no question of giving zakat to such a party. So zakat is primarily for those people who either have nothing, or they don't have enough to fulfill their day-to-day needs. Whether it's the need for food, or the need for clothing, or the need for shelter, or the need for transport, or the need for even basic education. They're not able to get basic education. So sometimes what people do is they'll give zakat money to a family who has children that are going to school. Basic schooling is absolutely fine. But to give zakat to someone who's getting a university education, this is not appropriate. Because that is not the bare bones, that is not the necessity of, in order to live. It's not. That's an extra thing. Okay? Discharging zakat in one's own country as opposed to sending it to another country. Which one is better? What is the preferred? So Imam Muhammad, rahimahullah, the student Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, has written a very detailed treatise on this, of how zakat should be given to the local poor people. The people of each area should look after the poor people in their area. And he takes this from the hadith of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, what he said to Mu'adh radiyallahu anhu when sending him to Yemen, he gave him a series of advices, and while describing the zakat, he said, تُؤْخَذُ مِنْ أَغْنِيَائِهِمْ وَتُرَدُّ عَلَى فُقَرَائِهِمْ. It will be taken from their wealthy and spent on their poor, meaning the people of that area. The wealth, the money will be collected from the wealthy of that area and then spent back on the poor of that area. It wasn't that the zakat that's collected from Yemen is going to come to Medina, and from Medina it's going to be spent on the people out in Najran. No, it's going to be taken from there, it's going to be spent on the poor people there. So he makes a very strong case for this, that the people of each area are responsible for looking after the poverty in their regions. So based on this, many jurists have said that we should try to give preference to giving zakat in our own areas. Now someone might say, well, we live in these developed countries, are there even people that are eligible for zakat? My answer to that is that you will be surprised. If you really open your eyes and look at the conditions that many Muslims are living by, they might be living here, they might have been living here all their lives, but there are Muslims that are in dire need. And this really dawned on us when we took part in a project to create a Muslim food bank. People ask the same question, what food bank for Muslims over here, everyone eats, the government helps, this, that, and the other thing. But when you go out and look, you'll find that there's so many single mothers or widows, elderly people who's, either they're not getting any pension or it's definitely not enough for them. Somebody who's very, very sick and they're not able to. There's so many people, even in these countries. That's why you have poverty even in these countries. That's why you have homeless people in these countries. May Allah save us. But this is a chance for us to really look after our community. So if someone is expending all of their zakat locally, it's actually a very good thing. It's a good thing. Then there is another element also. And sometimes that element might take importance over spending locally, and that is if you have poor relatives. Because the Quran emphasizes spending on the close relatives. So, after the huquq of walidain, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا وَبِذِي الْقُرْبَى. So right away, dhul qurba, the close relatives, the closest relatives come in. And it has two elements. What Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has said in hadith, for someone who spends on their close relatives, they get the reward of silatul rahim, of joining family ties, and they get the reward of their sadaqah as well. And if they don't, then they are definitely incurring some of the sin of qati'atul rahim, where you have someone who needs your help, you're in a position to help them, they're your blood relative, but you're just not. And that's actually a sin. So, if somebody has family members that are in need, then it's okay to give them preference in zakat. In fact, it's commendable. It's a very important thing to give family members preference. There is one third consideration that I will mention, and that is sometimes different types of calamities befall different parts of the world. Natural disasters, sometimes a war breaks out, sometimes some kind of a plague breaks out, different things happen, and at that time the Muslims of that area are all of a sudden in dire need, like we saw with our Rohingya brothers and sisters in these last few years. It's a mass expulsion and ethnic cleansing of people who are left without home, without anything, without a country, all of a sudden, overnight literally. And what we saw in the mass exodus, probably the biggest, the largest mass migration in the history of mankind, is what has happened from Syria in these last few years. The largest exodus of mankind in the history of humanity. So yes, these are our brothers and sisters. They're in dire need. Some of them have spent the last 5 years in camps, in these refugee camps on the border of some country, hoping that one day they'll be allowed in. So sometimes these things take preference. So whether you disperse your zakat funds here or on this one, or on that one, I think there wouldn't be much disagreement that all of these are very important. Every one of them is important in their own way, and as long as we have people looking after each one, then everyone is kind of looked after. What we don't want to do, we don't want to become a people that are negligent and lazy in paying our zakat. Because, first of all, because it is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the Quran gives a very severe warning for this. وَالَّذِينَ يَكْنِزُونَ الذَّهَبَ وَالْفِضَّةَ وَلَا يُنْفِقُونَها فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ فَبَشِّرْهُم بِعَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ يَوْمَ يُحْمَى عَلَيْهَا فِي نَارِ جَهَنَّمَ فَتُكْوَى بِهَا جِبَاهُهُمْ وَجُنُوبُهُمْ وَظُهُورُهُمْ هَذَا مَا كَنَزْتُمْ لِأَنفُسِكُمْ فَذُوقُوا مَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْنِزُونَ. Those people who hoard, Allah says, they collect gold and silver, but they don't spend it. They don't give the zakat of it, as the hadiths mention. Then tell them that they should prepare for a very painful punishment. On the Day of Judgment, that same gold and silver that they used to keep, it is going to be turned into brands. You know how those branding irons that are used for animals? So the gold and silver that they had, it's going to be melted and turned into brands. It's going to be heated in the fire of Jahannam. And their faces, their foreheads, their sides of their bodies, their backs are going to be branded with that same gold and silver that they kept. And it will be said to them, هَذَا مَا كَنَزْتُمْ لِأَنفُسِكُمْ. This is what you were hoarding and keeping all to yourself. ذُوقُوا مَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْنِزُونَ. Taste the flavor of what you were hoarding. So it is something extremely displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it gives birth to many, many problems. One of the beauties of zakat, one of the reasons why zakat is called zakat, aside from the fact that it purifies our wealth, it cleanses our heart from the tendencies of stinginess and greed. It cleanses our hearts, purifies our hearts. It softens our hearts because it compels us to think of and look for other people. Some of the basic etiquettes of zakat. Zakat needs to be given with ikhlas. It needs to be given with the intention of zakat. If you're giving something as a gift, you cannot later retroactively make an intention, oh, whatever I gave back then, I'll just count that as my zakat. It doesn't work like that. The intention of zakat has to be made before giving that zakat. The other thing is, many people, they give their zakat to organizations that collect zakat. So, as I mentioned earlier, the responsibility of getting zakat discharged is yours. So if you're giving it to an organization, maybe they can be your wakil, your agent, but it's your job to make sure that they're doing their job. So choose reliable people, choose trustworthy people. And according to the majority of the fuqaha, you cannot use zakat for social things. You cannot use it even for religious things like masajid, Islamic centers, schools. Zakat has to go to an actual person. Zakat has to go to an actual person. It cannot go to creating a building or to create an asset. It needs to go become the ownership of a person in order for zakat to be discharged. Okay, so keep this in mind. If somebody goes and makes a well for someone and say, okay, poor people will drink from it and this is from zakat money, the zakat is not discharged because who did you give it to? You actually didn't give it to anyone. Yes, you did a great thing as a sadaqah, as a charity. It's a great thing to make a well for people and provide them with water. It's a great reward. It's mentioned in hadith. But your zakat is not going to be discharged by doing this. So it actually has to go to people. So whichever organization you give it to, whoever's collecting zakat, whether it's a masjid or anyone else, find out where is this zakat going. And what some organizations do is they use that zakat to pay the salary of the people that are working there. So this is not appropriate. If they're collecting other donations for that purpose, then it's fine. But the zakat itself needs to go to those people that are in need. This is something that we need to verify for ourselves. Now, we've gone over a kind of a rough overview of zakat. Definitely not close to covering the subject in detail. Every aspect that I've talked about, it has many sub-aspects to it. But I hope this would at least give us a bit of an understanding of how to prepare ourselves and how to discharge. Ideally, we should sit with ulama, and any confusions that we have, we should get them clarified. Any questions that we have, get them clarified. Everyone's situations are unique to them. It's not possible to cover every scenario in a general talk like this. But as I said, over the next few days, over the next few weeks, feel free to come and talk to us and ask us and present your specific ahwal. Ikhlas and sincerity is also very important in zakat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, la tubtilu sadaqatikum bil manni wal adha. O you who believe, do not invalidate, do not nullify or cancel out your charities by doing one of two things. One is al-man, that you spend on someone and then you kind of show them that you've spent on them. You make them feel that you've spent on them. I've done this for you, I've given this to you. Or you say it behind their back, I've helped so-and-so out, I've given them zakat. Well, there's two problems with that. One is your own ikhlas is in danger. And the second thing is that you're hurting someone's feelings. And then the reward of whatever charity was done is cancelled. Allah says, La tubtilu. So ibtal means to cancel, as if it was never there. It's null and void. And the other way that those charities are cancelled is al-adha. That because you have helped someone out, now you mistreat them. And mistreating them could be that now you expect them to do favors for you, and if they don't, now you're like giving them a guilt trip, or you're blackmailing them, or you're compromising, you're making them feel bad. Do this for me, do that for me. Any of these kinds of things, they ruin and waste our reward. Another thing, which is a big kind of a, it's become a bit of a problem in the Western countries especially, is where we get our name announced for our charitable things. So this is against the nature of charity. Remember one thing, that giving sadaqah, alaniya, spending alaniya, meaning openly, where people can see that you're giving, this is for when other people will be encouraged to give. That's when we spend openly. Like Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, on some occasion he told people to spend, so Sahaba came forward and they spent openly. But the default is to spend secretly. The default is to spend secretly. Like the hadith talks about, someone spending so secretly that when he gives with his right hand, his left hand doesn't even know. And I'll relate that hadith to you. It's a riwayah of Musnad Ahmad, where Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says that لَمَّا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ الْأَرْضَ جَعَلَ التَّمِيدِ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this earth, it was unstable, it was shaking, and it was moving. So فَخَلَقَ اللَّهُ الْجِبَالِ فَقَالَ بِهَا عَلَيْهَا فَاسْتَقَرَّتْ بِهَا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the mountains, and He fixed those mountains into this earth, and those mountains acted as weights to balance this massive globe, and then it became stable. So before, it was like teetering, tottering, it was shaky. Then with the weight of the mountains, it became stable. Just like how I give the example of how tires are balanced by adding little weights. So then what happened? فَعَجِبَتِ الْمَلَائِكَةُ مِنْ شِدَّةِ الْجِبَالِ. The angels were surprised at how powerful these mountains were. فَقَالُوا يَا رَبْ هَلْ مِنْ خَلْقِكَ شَيْءٌ أَشَدُّ مِنَ الْجِبَالِ. Is there something more powerful than these mountains that are keeping the earth, stable? Is there something even more powerful than this in your treasures? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, yes, al-hadid, yes, steel or iron, because with that steel you can carve right through those mountains, you can break those mountains. So then the angels were surprised that, oh, steel, it's something that's more powerful than these mountains that are holding this earth together. So then they said, oh Allah, is there something more powerful than this steel? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, yes, fire. This fire will melt that steel. So the angels were more surprised. They said, oh Allah, is there anything even more powerful than that? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, yes, water. And water will put out that fire that will melt the steel, that will break through the mountains. The angels were more surprised. They said, oh Allah, is there something more powerful than that water? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Naam ar-rih. Yes, wind. Because when the wind blows, the water can't stand in front of it. In fact, the wind will dictate to the water where it has to go. So the angels were more surprised. They said, what a powerful makhluk. Oh Allah, is there something even more powerful than this? Allah said, yes, there's one thing more powerful than this. Ibn Adam tasaddaqa bi sadaqatin bi yaminihi fa akhfaha an shimali. The thing that's more powerful than all of these elements, all of these natural systems and powers, is Ibn Adam when he gives charity so secretly that when he spends with his right hand, his left hand doesn't know about it. This amal in the sight of Allah is more powerful than all of these things in this universe. So this type of giving needs to be revived. We have, as Muslims, we have a very rich heritage of this, and we should be proud of that. Imam Zainul Abidin rahimahullah, for years, and people didn't know it while he was alive, but the day that he died, then people came out of their houses wondering why the sacks of food that used to be placed in front of their house in the middle of the night, every night, for the last so many years, how come those sacks weren't there? There were some 70, people discovered later that there were some 70 families that Zainul Abidin rahimahullah was himself carrying sacks of food in the middle of the night and placing it there. He was feeding these people on his own expense. Nobody knew about it. And when they were washing his body, they found the marks of labor on his back. And they said, such a wealthy man, looks like he's been working as a laborer all his life. That's when people made the connection that, oh, he was the one personally carrying this and delivering it to those poor people. So ikhlas goes a long way. Somebody came to Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi. Imam Malik rahimahullah has started compiling the Muwatta, the famous book of hadith, the Muwatta, at the request of the king of that time. So Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi had started, and it took him many, many years to complete this work. Many years. Some say maybe 16 years it took him to compile this Muwatta. While he was in this process, somebody came to him and he said, oh Imam, you have taken so long. One of your contemporaries has already compiled another Muwatta. He has compiled it. He was also a great muhaddith and a great faqih of his time. He compiled a book, titled it Muwatta, had copies of it made. They said, oh Imam, you don't need to do this now because someone has already done it. At that time, Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi said something very strange and very powerful. He said, "Alladhi kana lillahi baqiya." The one that was done for the sake of Allah, that's what's going to last in this world. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed us. So many centuries later, some 12, 13 centuries later, the Muwatta of Malik is everywhere. Nobody can call themselves a scholar if they have not studied this book in detail. This is qabuliyat and this is ikhlas. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us ikhlas in all our a'mal. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our worship in the coming month of Ramadan and enable us to spend this month in the way that pleases Him. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to spend our wealth in a way that pleases Him, pay the huquq that are due to Allah and the huquq that are due to His makhluk as well. We have a series of programs. Some have been announced already. Some of you may have received the Ramadan calendar. So it's going to be, inshallah, a very busy month. We have 2 programs daily. One will be after Fajr. This will be the summary of the Quran that is going to be recited that night in Taraweeh. This is going to happen after Fajr. And we are trying to have, and we probably will have a live streaming for that as well, for those of you that have to go to work, or those of you that want to listen from home and so on and so forth. The second daily session will be during our Taraweeh, most likely after the 4th rak'ah. We'll have a short session, most likely on hadith. And it will be a short 10-15 minute session, and then we'll resume our Taraweeh. These are the daily programs. Then we are starting a course, inshallah. It's going to commence from this Sunday. Know the Quran. Some of you may have seen the posters and so on and so forth for it. This is a course that you need to register for. So go online and register for it. This is going to take place every Sunday after Dhuhr, inshallah. And inshallah, other programs and things will continue. We look forward to spending this month of Ramadan with you brothers, and you keep us in your du'as. Wa sallallahu wa sallama wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.